And I must say, and I'm not just saying this to be polite or saying diplomatic words, but it was really an honor to have the four of you with YIISA for the year. It was really, I enjoyed our conversations. I wish we had more. It's sort of running around a lot this year. But to have four scholars really committed to the issues and engaged in the issues has been really a privilege. So thank you. The first speaker will be Idit Shalev. And very briefly, Idit will speak about how forms of power affect attitude towards minorities. Idit was previously a supervisor at the Child Study Center at Schneider Hospital, Children's Hospital in Israel. She taught at Tel Aviv University in the School of Psychotherapy and was a fellow in social psychology at the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. And she was in clinical psychology at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Florida. She has a PhD from Haifa University, magna cum laude. I know that. And she also did her MA at Tel Aviv and a BA at Tel Aviv, also in psychology and special education. And she has a paper coming out with YIISA in the working paper series on Hamas and sort of issues of motivation to avert to kill for causes. It's a very good paper and will be coming out shortly. So, Dr. Shalev.
So I suggest because I'm going to present data that I collected the last 2 weeks, I suggest that we use this forum as brainstorming. I would like to present to my way of thinking of ideas, and I would like to hear if you have suggestions how to continue these studies. So actually I will start with a part from the Hamas Charter, which was the inspiration for this study. As you can see, I'm not going to talk about the Hamas Charter, I'm going to just look at this part. It's just cited from there, and you can see the frequency of the word, the association, money, Jews, money, control. And this is a kind of thing that we know from everyday basis. I talk to my scholars here, historians, and they all said, well, this is common knowledge. But in psychology, we don't look at things as common knowledge. We should empirically validate them. And I was curious to see what is the association between money and Jews, or money and attitude towards minorities? Is it real? How does money affect our life? Do we really, when we have money or when we don't have money, does it affect our attitudes? And I don't talk about chronic situations where somebody is rich or poor. I'm talking about, and I will expand the theory, but we actually talk about situations where we feel that we have more money or less money. How does it affect us on an everyday basis? Because the idea underlying it is that there's no such a thing as chronic situation. Like we change our attitudes all the time, and we are affected by cues, contextual cues, things that we read, situations, images. All of these affect us on an everyday basis. And I was specifically curious about the association between money and Jews or minorities in general. So here's another citation from something that I found in the internet. This is actually a poem about the Jews. Again, you can see the association, Jews and money, and the money is the god of the Jews. And so here's something that I already explained, is that if we want to look at this association from a psychological point of view, we should, and this is also explained as the methodology, we should we need to understand that actually the association, money and something affect our behavior immediately. So if somebody reads a text, in the text he sees the word money, money, money 10 times, then his behavior should be congruent to the text. But we don't know exactly what is the association. Maybe money causes us to be more generous. Maybe money causes us to be more racist. We don't know what it is. We should study this empirically. So this is actually the theory that we see. If we see images, different kind of images, it could be symbols, it could be words, it could be just faces of people. Everything affects our behavior in a congruent way. So the first question was, what is the psychological effect of having money? And what is the psychological effect of not having money? How does the power between, the association between money and power affect our attitudes towards minorities? And does the association between money and power is specifically associated with Jews? Or is it that we just judge the world in general in terms of like money or no money, like, and not specifically something that we pick on Jews? So first thing that when we do an empirical research, you should look and see what is in the literature. So the literature shows that reminders of money causes people to be less helpful. And it's not, and this is very interesting because it's not that when we think of money that someone else has. When we experience having money, we become less helpful and we become more lonely. We don't care about people. We don't try to share. We don't try to help people. And this actually was the citation. It was like published in Science. This is a major journal. And it's kind of interesting because we usually think of money as something that is helpful. So other findings show that thoughts of losing money, thought of having money is like kind of like blunted the pain of being rejected. Thoughts of losing money, in contrast, increases the pain of rejection. So that means that money is something that actually, on the one hand, it's like kind of like recovery from social pain. On the other hand, when we have money, we don't really care of other people. But the association between money and racial attitudes or attitudes toward minorities was not studied, and this is what I did in study 1. So if the experience of having money is associated to reduced helpfulness towards others, preference of play alone, work alone, and put more physical distance, we would expect that when primed with money, individuals would be also higher in negative attitudes towards minorities. However, when primed with non-money, not having money, individuals will be lower in negative attitudes towards minorities. And this is kind of like counterintuitive because we usually think that when people don't have money, then they become more racist, or then they become helpless, or then they become... And so my prediction was opposite, that when we have money, then maybe we want to keep the money. We want to preserve the money, the power. So that's why, and this is kind of thing that I want to consult you. Like, how do you think? What's the theory? Because like in psychology, we don't like have preliminary theory that we project on the findings. We look what we have, and then we sample by sample, and then we try to generalize it into structure a theory. So I don't know what the theory is yet. So in study one, I actually, it was conducted here in Woolsey Hall, 36 undergraduate and like 34 females, 30 males. They participated in the study in exchange for $2. Actually, all of them Yale students. And the study was presented as a questionnaire on social attitudes. They were, at first we give them consent form. They need to agree for the study. And they were asked to recall a life experience. One group were asked to recall life experience where they had money. And the other group were asked to experience life experience where they didn't have money, and just to write it up, just to imagine it, like some kind of visual imagery, and to write up a paragraph, that's all. And then they were just asked to fill out a survey. The survey is called, it's called the Social Dominance Scale. So here is the instruction. Think about a time where you had a lot of money, and then one group only were asked to think about a time where they had money, the other group only think about a time where they don't have money, and then social dominance scale. This is a scale that studies attitudes towards minorities, and in general, attitudes towards social hierarchy. So it actually includes 60 statements rated from 1 to 7, and here are some samples of the scale. Some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups. If certain groups stayed in their place, we would have fewer problems. So this scale is actually correlated with racism, sexism, nationality, and so forth. So the hypothesis was that experience of having money as compared to not having money would be associated with higher scores in the social dominance scale. So I did the t-test. What is really important here is just to see that the mean of the group that there was significant difference in social dominance scores for money and no money between the two groups. So the group that, so actually all Yale students are not racist because like if the scale is from 1 to 7, you can see that in the higher group it was 381, which is still in the average, but there was a significant difference between the group that was primed with experience of having money and the group that was primed with not having money, showing that the experience of having money really affect our attitudes and we become even temporarily more we want to preserve the power, we don't want to share it, we want to keep it. And this is interesting, to me at least. So in study 2, I was interested to see, study 1 was just tested the general association between money and attitude towards minorities. Study 2, the goal was to see if when we have money, who do we want to share it with? Do we want, if we have like the choice to keep the money or to share the money with either Jew, American Jew, Asian Jew, Asian American, Afro-American, or Greek American, are we going to find any difference between the group? And so I used here a very useful paradigm from social psychology. This is called the dictator game. And in the dictator game, we actually, it's like hypothetical situation. Sometimes we do it with real money. I did it hypothetically because I don't have money. So I just, I did it hypothetically. So the participants were given a script and they said, okay, suppose that you have $10. You just got it like as a present, you have $10, you can keep part of the money and you can share part of the money and you can decide how much money you want to keep, how much money you want to share. And then the person that you can share the money with was either Asian American, Afro-American, American Jew, or I don't know, I don't remember the fourth group, but it was Greek. So here the hypothesis was kind of like interesting. I didn't know what to predict because on the one hand, if we don't like if Jews are associated with money, then on the one hand, maybe we want to share our money with the Jews more than other groups because if we give the money to the Jews, maybe we get something in return, like endowment. But on the other hand, we could predict the opposite. We could say, okay, if Jews have money, why would we give them more? I mean, so it's like, it depends, so this is why we need to do study 3 and study 4. But actually the prediction was that Jews will get less money than, more money than the other groups. And what I found, so actually 69 students, again, Yale students, the study was conducted here in UC Hall, and they participated in the study in exchange for $2. Okay, so here is exactly what I asked them to do. Suppose that you get $10, you can keep it, you can share it. So I have 4 different groups. And so the initial results, I didn't bring them numbers because the results were not significant and because the sample was too small. But what was interesting that I found is a tendency to share more money with Jews. And then the question is why? Is it like because of like some kind of hidden anti-Semitism, or maybe we like the Jews more, or like what is there? And on the other hand, the tendency to share was a tendency to share less money with Afro-Americans as compared to other groups. So this is kind of interesting. I don't know exactly what is So in general, the findings of the 2 studies showing that the financial power is associated with support in social hierarchy. The more money we have, the less democratic, or the less motivation we have to share our power with other groups. And then initial findings shows that individuals share more money tend to, or hypothetically agree to share more money with Jews than with other minorities. So what will be the future directions for studies? So one thing I started to do, and I still didn't collect the data, like some kind of extension to study one, because in study one I only checked the experience of me having money or me not having money. So now I thought, okay, but the difference if I have money or someone else has money. So I started to collect data that the participants need to experience a situation where someone else close has money and someone else distant has money, and like as compared to someone else close doesn't have money, someone else close someone else distant doesn't have money. And what was interesting was just like 10 participants. So it shows that the highest, and again, social dominance scale, so the highest scores of racism were found in the group that were asked to imagine that someone close has more money, has a lot of money. So like family member or close friend. And this could give us some kind of direction for future research that maybe Jews are perceived as close or as neighbors, not strangers. People that are associated with the people that we close to, like we just like the Jews, but they have more money. So maybe the mechanism is some kind of social comparison or jealousy. I don't know. Another thing that I should do in future, because I just collected the data here in Wolseley Hall, and Yale students are not racist, and we have like some kind of like, most of them are coming from a specific social economic group. It's not like so the sample is pretty is homogeneous. So I think in future what I need to do is just to elaborate it and to study them, to collect data like from non-students. Another thing that I thought that could be interesting is that it's not enough to see to look at the association between money, like money, power, and Jews. Like maybe the hidden interpretation is that the Jews they like something connected with corruption, like money, Jews and like money is corruption and Jews are corrupted, so something like that. Something because like, it's not enough, because I found that experience that when we have money we become less tolerant to other people, but maybe it's not enough to explain some kind of hidden form of anti-Semitism, if at all. So actually that would be all. I think one more thing that I should say, that these studies are different than the general notion that we know, or that at least me heard about anti-Semitism in several ways. One is that I didn't study anti-Semitism or anything like in different, like I studied it here in the United States, where if we have racism, it's more hidden, it's not something explicit. This is among students, of course, it's more implicit. The other thing is that the theoretical methodology that I used is not just to interview people, because we don't believe in psychology that when you interview people you get accurate information. You should actually use more manipulative strategies to get to get what is there. And so if I went interview people, what do you think about maybe I would find something, but I'm not sure that this is exactly it, because there is like many biases of self-report, and so this is the other thing that I wanted to say. Okay, actually that's all. I would really appreciate if you have questions, suggestions for future research.
I'm sorry. You're Ms. Shalev?
Shalev.
I'm sorry. So Ms. Shalev, I'm wondering, you do the second study and you say it's statistically not significant. So I'm wondering if you want to change your slide from the word shows to suggest.
Yes,
I don't know, Hebrew equivalent,
absolutely.
Because
No, it's not shows yet.
even though it's not statistically significant, which you know as a psychologist, but I only know what that term says. I don't know how you find out significance. It points you in some direction, so there must be something from the data or the debriefing you could say about it. Otherwise, you're sort of saying, well, my study wasn't significant, but this is how I
There's tendency, okay, it means that
that's
there's
a common
tendency,
thing for psychology.
so you need to increase the sample, because you see some kind of differences, but these differences could be random because the sample is too small, and so you can see, okay, but when it's significant, it means that you pass some kind of statistical test that shows that it's not random. So what I saw, because it's a small sample, so I saw tendency.
Well, how many were in the second study? 69?
60 something, but it's like 4 different groups. So it's like 15 or something like in each
Just
group.
69, because it wasn't that much smaller than the first. It's just the numbers didn't come out that much different.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, exactly.
So maybe there's other data in the 69.
Yeah, but I don't know about the study. But sure, I don't know
You
about
don't
the
just
study.
throw it away. I mean, I guess I'm
Yeah,
saying there
just
must be
very
lots of
large.
scholars who come out with that problem where the numbers don't show significant difference, but the studies still worth something for something.
No, it doesn't
You know what I
worth
mean?
anything at
Is
this
that
point.
right?
I should collect more data. This is pilot study, so in pilot study we just see, because it was not studied empirically, though like we always say Jews, mania, nobody did any study. So it just you want like to see what is there, and then like if there's something at all or not. So this is what I did. This is a pilot study, and then I think that there is potential. I think it should be elaborated, but not more than that.
One question, did you take the background of the respondents?
Yes,
The
ethnicity,
ethnic-
age.
Did you compare for any
So,
differences between the ethnic backgrounds respondents to sharing? Because that could be very interesting.
I know it's interesting. So in study 1, I didn't find any correlation between the ethnicity or tendency to the social dominance scale. In study 2, the sample is again too small, so it was like 5. I just talked about it in the group. I had like 2 Germans. They had the tendency to give more money to Jews, and like most of the sample was included like white people. I didn't see anything in the data, but I think it's an important direction to study.
And then also, I was going to say, I think that the samples, the population of the sample are, it's a very elite group of
Exactly.
people with a certain culture. Maybe
Exactly.
they're driven to succeed and to obtain power. In a sense, this is what they're being educated to do.
Yes.
So that has to have an impact, and it could be interesting to compare to other
Exactly.
groups in the population.
Yes.
And the only other comment I'd say, the economic crisis or the economic condition, I think has a very obviously powerful effect on the media and the economy. How the economy has been affected and the portrayal of it in the media is making people feel, to some extent, an insecurity about the issues that you're speaking of. And how does that impact on these issues?
Yeah,
so
this
that
is great. Like to show people, to have them, this is another study that could be done. Have people like read a newspaper, part of the newspaper about the economical situation, and then to see if this affects social dominance scale.
And then one thing, I know some people that are extraordinarily wealthy, and for all sorts of perhaps psychological reasons in their lives, they feel that they're on the verge of being impoverished. And people survive.
That's very true.
No, people survive the wars, but people have a history where they, I know people literally have millions of dollars, but they won't turn on the air conditioner because it's too expensive, even though they would like to turn it on. There's people with all sorts of perceptions of wealth and security.
Yes.
So I don't know how you.
So wealth. So you think that wealth is associated with insecurity?
No, I don't know. Some people may feel very wealthy with a few hundred dollars in their bank account, whereas others may not. So I don't know.
This is very interesting, like a mediation that Charles suggests to look at mediation as like attachment or a sense of security. How does it mediate the connection, the possible association between money and racism? So it's something, it's very interesting
A student may
stuff.
feel very rich with $20 in his or her pocket and going on an evening on the town, they may feel great.
So it's like the perception of being rich as compared to the real money that you have.
I am also a social psychologist, and I'd like to tell a little story first and then give some thoughts. The story is, and I'm also the president for the state of Connecticut of a nationwide nonprofit that basically helps people to be better managers of their own money. Some of whom have a lot of money, and invested themselves, some invested with the help of a finance person, and there's some mixtures. Okay, let's say you had $10,000, all right? Where did this $10,000 come from? Let us say there's 3 possibilities. One, you inherited it. 2, you earned it, and 3, you won it in the lottery. It's the same $10,000. If you work for the money, the research has shown that you will use that $10,000 to pay down your mortgage or pay down significant bills. If you won the money in the lottery, the feeling is, the research has shown, it's the same check for $10,000 will be used to go on a vacation or buy a watch or some kind of splurge. And third, if you inherited the $10,000, that money will be used to honor in some way and respect the values of the person who gave it to you. It is the same amount of money, but it is handled in entirely different ways because of its origin. And I think that that's really important in what you're trying to do. That's Roman numeral 1. Roman numeral 2 is that I think, as Charles said, the origin of the people, that not only the origin of the people where their ethnic and religious origin of each of these subjects, where they came from, but if you ask students here versus Jewish students in Colorado or in Berkeley, you're going to get, I would imagine, 3 different answers versus if you ask Jewish students in New York City. I think there's a lot of questions around a lot of the things. I think what you're trying to do is really important, but I think there's an awful lot of questions that can, quote unquote, contaminate the research as well as the results. The location of where you're asking it, if the person is with another person, the amount of money that you're asking, if you're asking students in comparison to adults. There's now showing, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have had articles saying that a lot of the bashing of Goldman Sachs was attributed to anti-Semitism, and not just what's happening now, right now, last week, but what's been going on for the last couple of months. That's a whole different order of magnitude. And my concern is that people will take your results and use it in whatever way they want to. So I think you have to be really, really careful. This is a very explosive topic.
Pilot study. This is
Not the pilot study. Not the pilot study. The work that you're going to do after. You know, the population that will be statistically
So usually what you do when you publish, you actually you should give data, you should describe the sample, and then if the sample is homogeneous, of course it limits the ability to generalize the finding. But no study, I mean, unless like you do like national surveys or something, and then you have usually if you want to study specific topics, so you have like some kind of characteristics for the sample, and then you're finding. So but I'm explaining not to you, I'm explaining to everybody. So of course, but what I did here is an initial. You know, check like pilot study to see what is there. Not more than that, so no need to worry. I don't think that this is like the preliminary study. We usually do like 6-7 studies which will start something.
We're running out of time, so Professor Reyes, and then
I agree with what's been said about the future study. It should be a more random sample. I mean, you didn't, these were not Jewish students, right? They were general students, right? The ones you
Just
interviewed?
students,
Yes,
some
sure.
of them
And they should be non-students and including general, random sample of opinion across adults
Yes.
and young people. The second, even then you have a problem of the so-called Hawthorne effect. You go there and you talk to them, they want to know what you really want them to say. You have to be careful about that, they don't anticipate the answer you want.
Yes, of course.
And that's very subtle,
Yes.
very difficult to overcome.
Yes.
The third thing I
Yes.
wanted to say is that it would be good for the future study to ask people, why do you think Jews have money? Did it come from?
Absolutely.
Did they come because they're corrupt, or because they were
Yes.
forced into money lending? You know, there are different, very important differences.
Interpretation.
Yes, and that I think makes a lot of difference as to why they think Jews are associated with money.
Yes.
And then it might be good, if you could, it's a different story. There are other groups, like overseas Chinese, who have similar characteristics to the Jews. You know, maybe minorities, especially if they're prohibited from doing certain things, as the Jews always were, forces them into activities which are then money-making. And the overseas Chinese have a similar problem in Indonesia and in India and in other countries in Asia. That would be another study. I'm not saying.
Yes, of course, it's another story. I just wanted to say about what you said about the participants guessing the study goal.
What you want.
So what you do is after you run the study, you just give them debriefing, and then you ask them, do you have an idea what did we try to study? And so if they say yes, if they guess the study goal, so that you should not use the data. Because like if you want to study implicit association, you should not use the data.
Again, they may not tell you what they really think.
So yeah, but I really agree with all the important notes.
Just to address the point made by this lady sitting over here, you said how the money is obtained determines how it's spent.
Contributes, yes.
I take very strong exception to that. I would think that the personality of the person will determine how the money is spent, not how it's obtained.
Well, I'm sure that the personality of the person contributes to it, but these were statistically significant studies that were done at major and not with students, with adults. And there's Harvard has a symposium every year about research and finance and money, and that's been a running theme for the last 5 years. People continue to do research on that theme. So, you know, you certainly have your thoughts, but the research has shown what I said to everyone.
Well,
Okay, thanks. Got to the last comment, and we're going to go to the
Yeah,
next.
I was just wondering if how much of who you are as a researcher, if they see you have an accent, you're white, could possibly affect the answers they're willing to give you.
Well, so the idea of, I didn't explain it, because I didn't explain the whole thing. So the theoretical idea is that we call it priming. That I give them, what I gave them to read, think of the experience of having money, and then give them a survey, which is like presumably unrelated to what they did before. So the idea is that the experience of having money will affect the way that they fill out the survey. And so if I found, if I have two groups, one group has like money, one group doesn't have money, and then I found I found like a difference between the groups. So that means that there is difference. So if I was the same, I did the whole study, so I didn't have any research assistant. So like if I sampled the whole student, everybody got my accent and everything. So the idea is it didn't affect anything because all the participants got the same treatment. And but even if I had like an RA, and so maybe I should like statistically see like to compare the participants that I did with the participants that the RA did, and then to see if there's difference. But in this case, there was no RA.
So indeed,
Thank you.
thank you, Edith. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Michelle. So Michelle Sieff is going to speak today about, I think Michelle will speak and then we'll take a break. Then we'll get to other speakers. So Michelle's topic is the ultimate betrayal, human rights groups, genocide, and totalitarianism in the post-war era. Michelle's a postdoctoral research associate with us at YIISA, and she's worked for several organizations in the area of human rights, so she has practical experience. She worked with the Eurasia Group, Human Rights Watch, the Danish Refugee Council, Revenue Watch Institute, and the American Jewish Committee, AJC. She did her doctorate degree in political science at Columbia University, and her thesis analyzed transitional justice institutions in Africa. She's written articles, academic articles, as well as published in the Christian Science Monitor, the World Today, World Politics Review, and the World Policy Journal. And her work at YIISA has been on the intellectual components of left-wing, or some of the left-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Thank you, Michelle.
No PowerPoint, sorry. Great outside technology.
Your Twitter sometimes.
These So my research has been focused on the human rights and international law arguments to advance anti-Zionist claims. Over the past decade, if you follow the news, since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, and especially after Israel's wars with Hezbollah and Hamas, criticisms of Israel's treatment of Palestinians and other Arabs in the name of human rights and international law have dramatically increased, both in terms of their quantity and in terms of the qualitative seriousness of these claims. Over the past decade, the number of human rights reports criticizing Israel has certainly increased, and I think now constitutes a disproportionately high amount of the overall output of human rights groups. Just looking at the organization Human Rights Watch, they admit that their reports on Israel over the past decade constitute 15% of the overall output of the Middle East Division. The Middle East Division covers 17 countries, so the fact that one country is 15% of the Middle East Division's overall output, I think, certainly suggests that it's a disproportionate amount at this point. But in addition, the qualitative content of the criticisms has become far more serious. During Israel's wars against Hezbollah and Hamas, Israel was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And these are crimes which are subject to universal jurisdiction in international law. So these criticisms were made after both the 2006 Lebanon war and the more recent war against Hamas in Gaza. On the other side, aside from what these reports say, I think it's really important to take note of what they don't say. These reports end up being strangely silent about the fact that both Hezbollah and Hamas articulate what I would describe as totalitarian ideologies. And I'm using Hannah Arendt's concept of totalitarianism, which is fundamentally about calling for the extermination of a group from the earth. For example, the Hamas Charter explicitly calls for Israel's destruction and the elimination of a political community, and I think that you can also argue that it calls for the genocide of the Jews. So the stresses and silences of human rights groups, the very serious criticisms of Israel, and the silences about totalitarian ideologies have huge moral and political implications. First, these criticisms of Israel in the name of human rights and international law have correlated with a gradual erosion of Israel's legitimacy and the increasing sway of anti-Zionist arguments. I think that you can see this in the growth of boycott movements against Israel on university campuses around the world, which rely very prominently on human rights arguments and international law arguments. I think you can see this in the articles of Tony Judt, his 2003 article in the New York Review of Books, where he calls for the one-state solution, and also in the New York Times, where the one-state solution is now seriously discussed. And so these are liberal left publications, not fringe far-left publications. So again, the human rights arguments are central to these anti-Zionist claims, as well as to the way they are positively received. The Israeli government now acknowledges the link between criticisms of Israel in the name of human rights and Israel's eroding legitimacy. President Netanyahu recently identified the Goldstone Report as one of Israel's 3 most serious national security challenges, along with the peace process with the Palestinians and along with the Iranian nuclear threat. Second, the silences of the human rights reports and the failure to illuminate the totalitarian ideologies of radical Islamist groups are significant in that they help to publicly legitimate radical Islamist groups as normal, rational political movements. So I think the silences also have huge consequences. These consequences are a result of the enormous impact that human rights groups now exert on public opinion. They enjoy what has been called the halo effect. And so they are now the primary molders of public opinion about morality and justice in foreign affairs. So given the importance of these arguments, my purpose is to try and understand and explain the assault on Israel in the name of human rights. And if you were here for Professor Yakira's lecture a few days ago, what his book does, he didn't really go into his talk, but his book really tries to analyze the Holocaust arguments in anti-Zionist discourse. So I'm trying to get into another trope of anti-Zionist discourse, which is related to the human rights arguments. Okay, so one explanation explanation of these reports is that they are the result of anti-Semitism and its related phenomenon, Jewish self-hatred, since many of the groups and individuals who articulate these criticisms happen to be Jewish. A few responses. First, though I do think anti-Zionism in general, and specifically the human rights criticisms of Israel, are somehow related to the historical phenomenon of anti-Semitism, I really don't think it's worthwhile or illuminating to focus on this issue as such. Even the concept of anti-Semitism, in my mind, elides the specificities of Jew hatred over the centuries, and I think as intellectuals we have to be much more precise in identifying the specific arguments against Jews or Israel. So the concept of anti-Semitism, to just use it, I don't think it tells us very much. I think it's a way of saying that it's bad and it's dangerous, which I agree with. But I don't think it helps us to really identify in a precise way the arguments that we need to respond to. Second, since I myself worked for Human Rights Watch, all of my work prior to this has been focused on Africa, I was able to detect certain patterns in the work of human rights groups since they originated in the 1960s. So I think that it's a much larger phenomenon. In many other examples, such as Cambodia in the 1970s, Iraq in the 1980s, and also Rwanda in the 1990s, human rights groups failed to detect and combat totalitarian ideas and movements before they triumphed, which was obviously a catastrophe for human rights. Samantha Power, in her magisterial book, A Problem from Hell on genocide, she even reports in that book how in both Cambodia and Iraq, Amnesty International tried to downplay the accounts of refugees fleeing the violence. They labeled Pol Pot's slaughter and Saddam Hussein's arguably genocidal campaign against the Kurds as extrajudicial executions, which really, I think failed to illuminate at the time the precise nature of the ethnic-based slaughter that was occurring. So I think there is a larger pattern. In Rwanda, the human rights groups made a series of analytic errors, in my opinion. First, though the Hutu parties openly advertised their intentions to slaughter Tutsis, beginning around 1991, no human rights group reported on this when it was happening. Second, once the violence started, the human rights groups did spring into action, but even then they interchangeably labeled the violence war crimes and genocide, again conceptually confusing the issue. Third, they only recommended trials as a solution to the violence, and I think the gap between the prescription and the description, I think led people to distrust the argument that it was genocide. I mean, if you say there's a genocide and you call for trials, you really start to doubt then the description of the violence, because I mean it's pretty clear that to establish a trial in the middle of a genocide, it is not going to end the violence. So it's my observation of these patterns and silences and the stresses of human rights groups that led me to speculate that there's a much larger intellectual distortion going on. And this has manifested itself, I think, most visibly in reports on the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it's certainly not unique to the reports of that region. A second explanation for these human rights reports, and the one that's really peddled by the groups themselves, is that these reports are simply unbiased, objective applications of international law. They're just applying international law, which is out there, to the conflicts at hand. A few responses to this. First, this view of international law does not accord with contemporary debates over domestic law and jurisprudence. There's a very rich debate over how domestic law works, and it's generally understood that there is no simple application of law to a particular situation. It's a process of interpretation of law to a particular situation. So the position of human rights groups, when viewed from the perspective of domestic law, is very simplistic. Second, the process of applying international law is far more fraught with complications than domestic jurisprudence. There are three major bodies of international law that govern political violence. First of all, there are the laws that govern wars, which you've been hearing a lot about lately, which are the laws of war, and those derive from the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, which were signed in 1977. Second, there's a body of law that governs the ultimate crime, genocide, which derives from the Genocide Convention, signed in 1948. Third, there's also a body of law which governs political violence during peacetime, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And these derive from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also signed in 1948. So the process of even identifying which body of international law to apply to situations of violence is intertwined with a philosophical and political debate over what you define war. When do you call outbreaks of violence war? And it's only when you define it as war that you then invoke the Geneva Convention and the laws of war. So, and this was the essence of the debate between the Bush administration and human rights groups over the response to 9/11. The Bush administration wanted to define it as war and invoke the Geneva Conventions and its interpretations of the Geneva Conventions, but the human rights groups actually wanted to define it as a law and order problem where regular domestic law applied, and also the human rights laws that don't apply to situations of war, which are a lot less permissive. So it's much more realistic to say that the arguments of human rights groups are interpretations. And I think that's all missed in our current discussions. I mean, we simply treat the reports of human rights groups as this is international law, and there's no understanding, I think, at least in the popular imagination, that these are interpretations of law. So my theory focuses on the role of an ideology, an intellectual system, which has shaped the actions and practices of human rights groups. This intellectual system is what determines what types of violence human rights groups prioritize, the way they define and frame that violence, and their choice of solutions. This new intellectual system has been created and articulated by a new and very powerful class of intellectuals, international lawyers. So my research is also a sociological analysis of the rise and influence of a new class of intellectuals. Now, if you're familiar with the work of the French philosopher Raymond Aron, he wrote an important book in 1950, The Opium of the Intellectuals, where he analyzed the role of intellectuals, European intellectuals, in developing Marxist doctrines, which he argued was important to the survival of communism as a political movement. So he was analyzing the role of intellectuals. So I'm tracing the intellectual history of this modern human rights movement and looking at its spokespersons as this new class of intellectuals, a very influential class of intellectuals. Some of the authors that I am looking at that I think are very important to the human rights movement today are the German legal theorist Hirsch Lauterpacht. Don't know how to pronounce his name, but he was one of the leading international lawyers of the century. He was born in 1897 in Central Europe. He ended up having to leave. He was in Austria-Hungary, had to leave there because of anti-Semitism, went to Germany, even though he converted to Catholicism, and eventually had to flee to America. And he develops really a seminal text for the modern human rights movement called The International Law of Human Rights. A second theorist is Hans Kelsen, also a Jew born in Prague in 1891. Also loses his job for political reasons, and he also ends up in the United States. The more recent scholars who draw on the work of these German theorists are Richard Falk, who's a professor of international law at Princeton, and now the special rapporteur of the the UN Special Rapporteur for the so-called occupied Palestinian territories, and Louis Henkin, a professor of international law at Columbia. So, the people in the human rights groups don't often examine the intellectual assumptions that they are working from, but it's these theorists, these legal scholars that kind of have developed the ideas which they put into practice. So in my mind, these international lawyers have developed several specific myths which I'm trying to identify and describe, and these myths shape the practice of human rights groups. And I'll just go into one myth so I can show you how it might shape or distort the perspective of human rights groups. How am I doing on time? Sorry.
You're okay.
Okay. So in my mind, one of the reasons human rights groups don't seem to notice or care very much about the existence of totalitarian movements is that they believe that international law does and should only focus on individuals, both individual perpetrators and individual victims. They see international relations as fundamentally about the actions of individuals, where organized political movements and their doctrines and ideologies are relatively unimportant. The core foundational myth of the human rights movement is that after the Second World War, the nature of international law completely shifted its focus. Whereas before it used to focus on states, after the war, international law was primarily focused on the rights of individuals. This view is commonplace among human rights activists, and many scholars have coined labels such as cosmopolitan law and humanities law to describe this new international law of individual human rights. Now, this view of international law has a history, and it comes from Lauterbach, from his book International Law and Human Rights. And I'll just give you a quote, some evidence for what I'm saying today, from his book. Lauterbach argued that as a result of the Charter of the United Nations, as well as of other changes in international law, the individual has acquired a status and a stature which have transformed him from an object of international compassion into a subject of international right. For insofar as international law is embodied in the Charter and elsewhere recognizes fundamental rights of the individual independent of the law of the state, to that extent it constitutes the individual as a subject of the law of nations. And so Lauterbach pointed to the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also the precedents of the Nuremberg trial. So he made 2 points about the Nuremberg trial, both of which I'm going to critique, just to show you my method, which is to look at the ideology and then to go back to the history and unearth an alternative interpretation of these international legal precedents. So Lauterbach argued that he saw the prosecution of Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg as an acknowledgement of the, quote, fundamental rights of the individual recognized by international law. Second, Lauterbach argued that the central achievement of the Nuremberg judgment was to establish individual criminal accountability for crimes committed on behalf of the German state. In his mind, the judgment rejected all notions of collective responsibility and collective punishment. And he also saw the Genocide Convention in a similar light, that its central achievement was to establish individual liability for the crime of genocide. In my mind, this is a drastic simplification of the achievements of the Nuremberg trial and the Genocide Convention. And I think this view is dangerous because it reduces the post-war legal concepts to the types of impotent liberal ideas that proved so defenseless in Europe in the 1930s. In fact, the architects of the post-war order really intended to strengthen liberalism with more robust legal categories and ideas that could be used to detect and fight totalitarianism in the future. First, the concept of crimes against humanity was not intended to refer to crimes against individuals. It was intended to describe the crimes committed against the Jews as Jews. In general, the Nuremberg trial did not prioritize the crimes against the Jews. I don't know how much you all know about the Nuremberg trial, but it really focused on the crime of aggression and also war crimes. But at that time, the slaughter of Jews as Jews was not central to our understanding of what had happened in World War II. So the way that it was a very imprecise definition that the Nuremberg Charter used, but this is how they defined crimes against humanity as, quote, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. A very clumsy definition, but nonetheless there was an emphasis on extermination and also on violence on political, racial, or religious grounds. So again, the political part, it doesn't, that's a little more difficult, but the major intent of the concept was to get at the crimes against Jews as a group, the crimes against Jews because of their membership in the Jewish nation. Now, the concept of crimes against humanity is then folded into the Genocide Convention, which criminalizes attempts to exterminate groups based on race, religion, or ethnicity. Now, again, the concept of genocide is conceptually and morally distinct from other types of political violence. Let's say war crimes. With a war crime, you kill an individual as a means to an end because of what they do or are suspected to have done. The concept of genocide or crimes against humanity is intended to identify violence where people are killed simply because of who they are. So there's really an attempt there to capture something that's conceptually and morally distinct. And so the central achievement of this concept of crimes against humanity and the concept of genocide was to provide a conceptual and legal tool to recognize and prevent future attempts to define and exterminate groups. That was the real attempt to even come up with this concept. It was not to enshrine individual rights, as Lauterbach and the people who articulate this ideology today, people like R.A. Nair or Jeffrey Robertson, Ken Roth. I mean, they all kind of repeat this ideology of individual rights, even when discussing the concept of crimes against humanity. Second, Lauterbach's notion that all the Nuremberg judgment did was to establish individual criminal accountability for Nazi crimes is also reductionist, in my opinion. If you go back to the Nuremberg judgment, it also criminalized several elite Nazi organizations, such as the Gestapo, the SS, and the leadership corps of the Nazi Party. It labeled these as criminal organizations. And I think this aspect of the Nuremberg judgment has been completely forgotten in our contemporary histories of the Nuremberg trial. The purpose of criminalizing these organizations was primarily preventive and symbolic, to make the point that the mere existence and membership in a political organization such as really the Nazi Party, but yes, it only criminalized certain of the elite units of the regime, but it was to make the point that an organization that articulated such barbaric doctrines that called for the extermination of groups, that the extermination of Jews, that this should be viewed as criminal. And I'll just read you, Justice Jackson's statement to the court. And he's a wonderful writer. I encourage everyone to go back and read his arguments because they're very powerful. In administering preventive justice with a view to forestalling repetition of these crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, it would be a great catastrophe to acquit these organizations. It would be a greater catastrophe to acquit these organizations than it would be to acquit the entire 22 individual defendants in the box. These defendants' power for is spent. That of these organizations goes on. If they are exonerated here, the German people will infer that they did no wrong and will easily be regimented in reconstituting organizations under new names behind the same program. So he actually felt that the criminalization of these organizations was more important than the prosecution of the individual defendants at Nuremberg. I think when you go back and start to look at the international legal precedents that human rights groups want to draw on, I think that you can see that the post-war architects really intended to illuminate and prioritize organized attempts to exterminate groups. Certainly, the Genocide Convention is the only convention which imposes a duty to prevent on the international community, as opposed to a duty to just prosecute after the fact. Again, why does this matter? In my mind, it's their belief that their mission is to defend individual rights and to only see the world politics in terms of individuals, that these groups really have not prioritized crimes directed against collectives, organized attempts to exterminate groups. So they're not seeing these aspects of our political world, collective movements, political ideologies, political doctrines. They don't think that these are serious factors in global politics. They want to treat political violence like domestic murder as an individual phenomenon. And I think when you're looking at international relations, you just can't you can't look at them and treat them in the same way. So when you look at the recent reports, let's say the Goldstone report, you can read a 600-page report on that conflict and not see one line about Hamas's ideology. And obviously human rights groups defend their positions with scrupulous legal arguments. What I'm trying to do and to show is to show the genealogy of these ideas and to suggest that there are other alternative interpretations of international law, and they've kind of they've adopted one approach, which isn't the one I think that the founders of international law, who rebuilt the global moral order after World War II from the ashes of the Holocaust, I don't think that is what they intended. So anyway, that's to give you some example of what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. So thank you for your paper. I think your work is really good and important to
Thanks.
continued success. My question though, so I think your point in sort of the context and how, for example, in the Goldstone report, there's no sort of contextualization of not only the ideology, but sort of the political and military situation, in a sense, but certainly the ideology. And yet, and you speak about how international law is based on individual notions and individual rights. But it seems to me, as a non-legal person kind of following the situation, that in the Gold